according to Ovid, the hottest summer on record, by Ange Mlinko. This poem, being a retelling of an ancient myth, is better understood if we have some background knowledge first. As the author alludes in the title, the story told here is that of the second book of Ovid's Metamorphoses. The original work was a poem almost 12,000 lines long, spread across 15 books. In it, Ovid tells hundreds of myths, each of them containing some element of transformation, or metamorphosis. The second book largely focuses on the fall of Phaethon, a young man whose mother tells him to go to his father, Helios, the sun god, seeking confirmation of his divine lineage. To show recognition for his son, Helios swears to give him a gift, whatever he asks. Phaethon's wish is to drive the chariot of the sun for a day. Bound by his oath, Helios has no choice but to grant it, and so Phaethon sets off across the sky. However, he does not know the path he should take, nor how to control the horses, and so he drifts much too close to the earth, burning everything in his wake. Eventually, Zeus strikes him down to prevent further damage, and he falls from the sky to land in the mythical river Eridanus, lying dead amongst the wreckage of the chariot. In Ovid's telling, the transformation of his sisters into trees and his lover into a swan come about purely from the power of their grief as they refuse to leave the riverside for months after his death. In other tellings, the gods cannot bear to witness their suffering and give them new forms to relieve them of their human emotions. 32 of the 54 lines in this poem correspond directly to something written in Metamorphoses. Most of these are in section 2, where the first stanza is listing the many mountains that went up in flames, and the third stanza lists the rivers that dried up. With this context in mind, let's read the poem. If a legend from the sun's blazer fell through a prism, came into focus, joy-riding mustangs, Pyrrhus, Aeus, Aethon, and Phlegon, might it ignite half of California, if all the fossil fuel spent in engines in the span of a century could raise ocean temps by a degree, then should we say, we've been here before? Clouds began to smoke, earth flared, and made therewith so dry the green just disappeared. From pastures, leaves, trees were burned clean, corn combusted, mighty towns roasted, folk burnt, hardwoods turned to ash, new deserts arose, and islands joined. Athos, Taurus, Timulus, Ida, Helicon, the Muses' haunt, Haemus, Orpheus's neighborhood, Parnassus, Eryx, Cynthus, Orthrus, Rhodope and its ski trails, Mimas, Dindoma, Mycale, Cithaeron, Scythia's cold nights, the snow-capped Caucasus, Apennines, Alps. All their big game and small fled into the cracks of the earth, to Hades, where the glaciers trickled down, Vatnajökull, Jostedalsbrunn, Cenega, Chimborazo. The nymph's hair went up, boiled away. Boeotia looked for its Dirce, Argos for its Amymone, Ephyra for its Pyrene. The rivers steamed. Meander, Eurotas, Euphrates, Ganges. The gold in the Tagus melted. Nile, Rhine, Rhone, the Danube, the Po, the sovereign Tiber. The Cyclades became one as the sea shrank, stranding dolphins, seals. Bream went belly up and cooked on the sands, Medusas desiccated, reconnoitering birds asphyxiated. Earth's every volcano became more so, the moon stunned that the sun had come between them. Once the Hummer, Explorer, Escalade, whatnot, was smited necessarily as explained to the parents. The car crashed, the axle smashed. There were still those who lamented the kid. The bitter father, the mother on whose wild grief we cannot linger. The metamorphosis of humanity was complete. His sisters, Phthosa, Lampetia, et al., wailed so they turned into leafy poplars, weeping amber to this day. For all the restitution paid, in amber and in shade, they were still condemned by perfect strangers for mourning their stupid boy. It was his cousin Cygnus, shied into an uncouth fowl, who shunned company, stayed out of the sky, haunting retention ponds, blackwater swamps, intercoastal waterways, cooling his eyes. Ovid's Metamorphoses was written entirely in dactylic hexameter, the oldest known format for Greek poetry, and classic to Greco-Roman poetry in much the same way as iambic pentameter is to English verse. In contrast, this poem has no consistent meter, and any intermittent patterns of rhythm are so few and far between that they're presumably accidental. Aside from meter, though, many of Ovid's structural choices were mirrored in this poem. In part, this is because whole sections of both of them are just listing places that were affected by Phaethon's wild flight. Though this poem doesn't include all of the places listed in Ovid's version, those are exceptions to the rule. Largely, each name was copied over in order. As a result, Ovid's use of assonance, internal rhymes, alliteration, and slant rhymes to tie the listed places together and make them flow is carried over to this poem. Additionally, both poems are broken up into sections to isolate the different topics covered by the story. A comparison to Ovid's work when analyzing this poem is useful mostly for emphasizing the ways that they're different. As I mentioned before, a good amount of this poem directly corresponds to Metamorphoses, so let's look closer at the unique lines. The first stanza opens with wordplay, introducing the idea of comparing cars to the sun by using the literal meaning of the names of various car models to describe the original myth. At Mustangs, we return to the ancient era with the names of the horses that draw Helios's chariot, before being pulled back to current day, where we're asked if we should compare California's fires and the impact of global warming on ocean temperatures to Phaethon's ride. Though Section 2 is primarily pulled from Metamorphoses, the lines about melting glaciers are new, and their insertion into this sequence serves to further blur the line between the myth and our current reality. In Section 3, the cars are brought back, as the chariot is implied to be equivalent to a gas-guzzling SUV. By isolating these lines, it becomes clear that the purpose of this poem is to use the tragedy of Phaethon as a warning about the current climate problem. If the chariot is a car, or more broadly, the multitude of human tools and processes that rely on fossil fuels, then Phaethon is humanity itself. In our excitement over the power we were granted when we discovered the use of coal, oil, and gas, we took off running, placing our lives in their hands without considering the consequences. Now, we're showing no sign of stopping as we burn everything in our wake. In the myth, this is where Zeus steps in and puts a stop to our rampage. In the poem, it's unclear if that's what the author wishes. It's obvious the destruction that has been caused, and yet Phaethon's death is undoubtedly a tragedy. Perhaps, as Zeus explained, it was necessary, and yet we sit with the grief of his loved ones for 2.5 stanzas. In Ovid's poem, he tells of Helios's bitter grief. He refused to drive the chariot, saying that if no one else would, then Zeus should do it himself. Then, he said, he will know, when he has tried the strength of those horses with hooves of fire, that the one who failed to rule them well did not deserve to be killed. So, in the end, while we do need to cease our ever-increasing reliance on fossil fuels if we are to prevent our own destruction and the further destruction of our whole planet, we should not look unkindly upon our predecessors who did not know the terrible power of the elements they handled.